Hi, folks. My name is Alex Brown. I'm an assistant coach at Niles West High School in Illinois. And today we're going to be talking about the state's counterplan, how to go for it, how to answer it, and how to deal with different kinds of innovations that will happen throughout the year as it relates to it. Unfortunately, I'm having some weird tech problems, so I might be slightly looking to the side throughout this, but I'll do my best to carry on. So let's go over the structure of today's lecture. I'm going to start with some of the refresher stuff. This is stuff that's already been covered in previous lectures that you all hopefully have access to and have been checking out already, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. Then I'm going to be talking about how to upgrade your counterplan and how to go for it best whenever you're negative. After that, I'll be talking about it from the affirmative perspective on how to answer it well. And then I'll finish by talking about sort of different states counterplans genres that are technically the state's counterplan, but I think are a little bit different to the point where I'm giving them their own section because I don't think that you debate and answer them quite the same way that you do the regular counterplan. So let's start with the stuff that we've already covered. The two big lectures that you'll want to look at if you want to get a refresher on states are the topic content lecture, which was the very first one given by David Height. He talks about how states carry out the vast majority of the topic area, that they are things like the primary authority of water quality, they follow their own state regulations whenever it comes to the Safe Drinking Water Act, and things like water rights and the public trust doctrine are also mostly governed by states. The other one that I think is important to check out is Christina Phillips's Federalism and Water Policy. It plays a huge role, and she spends a lot of time talking about the different kinds of federalism that are relevant, as well as interstate compacts, which we're going to be talking about a lot today, and are, I think, super, super relevant to water policy. So really, if you haven't checked those out yet, please do so you can understand this better, and also, just for their own sake, because they're both very, very fantastic lectures. Instead, we're going to be talking more from like the debate side of things. So let's start with why states. So why is the states counterplan so popular? Why is it always a thing on so many topics? The states counterplan is what we call a functional limit. You've maybe heard that phrase whenever you've debated topicality, but you maybe aren't super sure what it means. Let me explain. The idea is that while there could be, theoretically, a lot of different affirmatives which are considered topical under any given topic, a lot of times they don't get read because they're just not that good. And teams don't really think they can win very well with them. Why are these affirmatives not very good? In a lot of cases, it's because of the state's counterplan. The idea is that states is so good on this topic that it automatically deters and stops people from cutting a lot of affirmatives that may otherwise be pretty good. And that's kind of intentionally part of the topic's creation, as well as the criminal justice topic from last year. That states really makes it so there is kind of a limit on the topic, even if it doesn't sort of seem like, even if it seems like the topic is actually quite big. I think that states is a great generic, even more so on this topic than on last year's criminal justice reform topic. I think that even if you aren't usually the kind of person who likes to go for the state's counterplan, I think you got to have it prepared because you really need to respect it. And if you are the kind of team who's writing affirmatives that don't respect the state's counterplan, you're probably going to end up losing to it at least a decent amount. So, what are some of the obstacles to winning with the state's counterplan? I'll start with one of them, which is obviously a little bit subjective, and that's kind of judges. Not all judges are always down for the state's counterplan. I think that there are some judges who sort of uh, there's a spectrum to which a lot of judges are cool with the state's counterplan. Some of them are like, bring it on, throw everything you can at the wall, do whatever you want, and they're very pro negative fiat. There are also a lot of other judges who are much more in favor of a limited. They're maybe more likely to think that 50 state fiat is theoretically illegitimate, or at the very least, 50 state uniform fiat is theoretically illegitimate. I think that, I'm not going to say whether or not these judges are correct or incorrect, but I think that there is kind of an understanding that you may have to debate states a little bit differently based on whoever is in the back, as well as understanding that maybe just taking some time to get yourself a good theory block on why the counterplan's justified, especially on this topic. Other things that I think can stop you from winning with states is being boring. I think that everyone kind of expects states to come, and so a lot of people are probably a little bit going to be adapting pretty quickly to make their state's counterplan blocks really good and really interesting and unique. And judges like hearing stuff that's unique. And so if you're not sort of innovating and developing your arguments, you're probably not going to be winning as many debates, which sort of ties in with my last point. You got to keep upgrading your counterplan. I might sort of disagree with some other coaches on this. I personally am in the camp of go ahead, add extra things to your counterplan, make it really strong, make it really powerful. And there are some other judges who think that that gets into a little bit more theoretical trouble. But I'm just going to sort of be talking about the different kinds of things that you might see teams do. Not necessarily saying you should be doing all of these things in every single one of your negative debates. So let's start by talking about the mechanics of the state's counterplan. I took like a sample counterplan text. I took the regular one from the Interstates Compacts counterplan in the starter pack, and then wrote the counterplan text so that it would solve the water infrastructure aft. So there's three big components that we want to kind of focus on here. The first is highlighted in yellow, and that's the actor. So you'll notice I didn't just say the 50 states should. I say the 50 states and appropriate, or sometimes you'll see relevant territories should. That just means that we include things like DC, Puerto Rico. They're parts of the U.S. as well, and they matter, but they aren't the 50 states. And so it still is important for us to be focusing on those. It is entirely possible that, let's say we're reading an affirmative that is entirely about one area. So let's say it's a counterplan that basically it's an affirmative that basically just takes place around like a certain river or a certain dam or a certain state. You could theoretically limit the counterplan to not be all 50 states and just be regional, just for the sake of logic. I think that makes sense. The last thing is related to whether or not appropriate territories includes tribal action. I think that you could fiat like the 50 states as well as tribal governments of the United States, but if you're going to do that, I would probably have some kind of evidence which says that tribal fiat is good or justified on this topic. As for whether or not that is practical, that's a very different question. I just want to point out that maybe some folks think that appropriate territories, including tribal governments, is legit, and maybe some people think that they are considered sovereign enough entities that they don't count as a territory of the U.S. The next thing I'll talk about is the action part. As you can see in this example, it mirrors the AF basically exactly. And you'll see that, I would say, most of the time. There are obviously some instances in which it's not, and those are mostly instances in which it's like literally impossible. For example, if the affirmative did something with the EPA and said that we should, reorganize the EPA, for example, it's obviously impossible for the states to reorganize the EPA because they don't have jurisdiction over the EPA. So obviously they wouldn't be able to do that. So you always don't want to mirror it 100%, just obviously as much as it makes sense. I think that this is also the action part is where we get extra components to the counterplan. So let's say you also want to add an extra plank that solves something else, like that funds the counterplan. You'd want to add it here as well as, alongside everything else, like the main part of the counterplan. The last thing we'll talk about is uniformity. When we say uniformity, we just mean the idea that all states act together and act the same way. A lot of arguments, like in the literature, against the state's counterplan and against the idea of states acting, focus on this issue of uniformity. So, for example, if, let's say, water quality. Let's say the government said entirely, like, the federal government's going to stay completely out of it. It's all up to the states to decide what they want to do. Most likely, if that happened in the real world, a lot of states would not really do a good job regulating their own water because they may tend to be states that are anti-regulation and would fear that too much regulation would impede what their voters want. So there are definitely going to be some states which are less likely to take that action. Now, there is also a problem of a spillover, which is an idea that's talked about in the Interstate Compacts Counterplan. The idea that states can do certain actions that negatively affect other states if those states don't act together. For example, Illinois is kind of noted for having some problems with gun violence, even though there are really strict gun regulations in Chicago. Part of the reason for that is because states that border Illinois don't have very strict gun laws, and so people can just drive to those states, get some weapons, come back to the U.S., come back to Illinois. The same thing is true for states maybe that have legalized marijuana while other states around them haven't. That's called a spillover problem, and if all states don't take the same amount of action, it maybe inevitably is going to have happening. Anyway, all of this is to say that lack of uniformity is a real problem in the real world, but in the debate world, we have negative fiat, and we can kind of fiat uniformity, which obviously isn't very realistic, but I think is very powerful and can help against what would otherwise be a very scary solvency deficit, especially on this topic. This is where you'll have some judges that get frustrated with theory, the idea that it's so unrealistic and that fiating all states act the same way can remove what's a pretty germane deficit to the literature. But one way that judges kind of that negative teams can kind of fight against that is through mechanisms like interstate compacts. They're very powerful. If on this topic especially, because there are so many existing interstate compacts, it's very easy for the negative to win that they are justified theoretically. If you can win that interstate compacts will not be challenged by Congress, which I think is pretty easy to do because it's not like Congress has to vote yes on them. They just need to, win that Congress won't say no to them in most instances. Then your counterplan gets a lot of power. Even if the content of the plan is unpopular, say, even if ordinarily a state like Alabama would never pass a really, strict, tough on, a really, really strict affirmative that does a lot of environmentally friendly stuff. It's not as if, a member of the House of Representatives is ever going to say no to what their state government wants. Which means that it seems unlikely to me that interstate compacts would ever really be challenged very much in Congress. The only reason, and the sort of last point here, is that you may not always need or want uniformity as part of your counterplan. There's this idea that exists in the literature for the state's counterplan about state experimentation. That's kind of the idea that, a one-size-fits-all approach might not work might not work for the country, and instead different states should sort of uniquely craft their own specific models that work best for their demographics or their geography, or what have you. And so you might have an internal net benefit that's about why state experimentation is a good thing, in which case you would probably not want to have a uniform 50-state compact that just does everything the same way, uniformly. But that's kind of its own specific thing, depending on how you want to write your counterplan. So, okay. What should your 1NC file have what should your 1NC section of your state's counterplan file have? First, you should have multiple distinct mechanisms for the 1NC. So you could have your just general 50 states should do water policy template and card, but you maybe also want to have something like your thing for whenever you want to do interstate compacts, your thing for whenever you want to include state courts as the actor for the plan. All of that stuff is what you would want to have prepared for the 1NC, depending on what kind of affirmative you're debating. The next thing you'd want is to have different tools that let you fiat through AF deficits. So I think one of the best examples of that, one of the best examples of that is, I think, funding and generating revenue. Water infrastructure is really expensive, and water policy can be kind of expensive. And states have these things called, balanced budget requirements, which basically prevent them from spending too much. They can't deficit spend. But you could theoretically get rid of those if we're fiating states can do whatever. I think that might be kind of difficult because you have to worry about, changing some states' constitutions, which would, I'm not sure if you can fiat. It gets a little bit complicated, so I won't go all the way in. But there are other means by which states can fund stuff. So some that are common are like legalizing marijuana as a source of revenue. Others say to impose really strict taxes on the super wealthy in every single state. And if you do that uniformly, it means they can't run away to other states. There's a lot of different theoretical ideas that the states could do to make money. And so I think that having one that you have a really robust defense of is, I think, a necessity for this year's topic. Other ones are, of course, going to sort of develop throughout the year. Different tools to fiat through solvency deficits so that eventually your state's counterplan will end up having a lot of extra planks to it. Speaking of planks, advantage counterplan planks should also be something that you have at the ready. You might not read them in every single round, but if you're fiating the states anyway, you may as well have some advantage counterplan planks that are state-based action that you can do to just get that extra little bit of solvency. So let's say that the affirmative has an advantage that you don't think the states solve. So let's say it's an advantage about the EPA, and the states obviously can't affect the EPA. Let's say the impact of that advantage is about warming, about cutting carbon emissions to solve climate change. The states could also just do their own warming policy. And so you could just directly fiat the states do whatever policy the affirmative says is good to solve warming, right? it might not get you 100% solvency compared to the affirmative, but it could get you pretty far, and, hopefully you have a pretty big net benefit that you can leverage against any solvency deficits or arguments they have. The last thing I'm going to say here is that if it's in your counterplan text, it needs to be read in the 1NC as a card. One thing that's really annoying is whenever a team adds on a ton of extra little thingies, a ton of bells and whistles into their state's counterplan, and then they only read like one card, and it's like 3 lines long, and it just says, it's cool whenever the states do things. That doesn't cut it. I think that you definitely, I think that it's some judges will disagree. Some judges will say you can do whatever you want, but I think that the expectation should be that you should read solvency advocates in the 1NC for your arguments. Otherwise, debates end up really sucking. They get really late breaking because the neg doesn't actually explain what their counterplan does until the 2NC, and might not even explain what the counterplan does in a way that matters until the 2NR. It's not fun, and it makes for much worse debates. So please read your stuff in the 1NC. It's okay if your counterplan is really big in the 1NC, because if your counterplan is really good, it's going to win no matter what. So it's okay to have a big counterplan in the 1NC. Embrace it. The last thing I'm going to talk about is kind of like the danger zone. It's not something that I'm going to say you always want to do, or is something I would say like I super highly recommend having all the time. And that's planks which include the federal government. So in this situation, you would like have the federal government do something, and then also have the states do the main thing. So let's say that they have an advantage or a solvency argument which says that the federal government will strike down the affirmative, or that, the courts will strike down, or pardon me, they have a thing that says that the federal government or the courts will strike down the counterplan as being unconstitutional or something. You could add a plank to the counterplan which just has the Supreme Court or the federal government uphold the counterplan. Here's the thing. Not only do I think that gets you in trouble, I think that gets you in trouble theoretically. I think that there's a really good multi-actor fiat bad argument to be made. I also think that it gets you in trouble with permutations, because you're using the same actor as the AF. I'm not going to talk too much about this. I just want you to know that I think that these are kind of dangerous, and I wouldn't really recommend reading them unless you absolutely need to. And they're just not as fun as the regular states counterplan, so I'm not really going to advocate for them very strongly at all. These are very risky. What should your 2NC file have? Alright, well, we said that we have all the mechanisms ready in the 1NC, so ideally you should have an overview, extra cards extending, and some explanation for all of your mechanisms for the 2NC. Straightforward, right? The next thing I want to point out is follow-on. I think follow-on's super underrated. I haven't really heard a lot of folks making this argument recently. Follow-on, for the uninitiated, is just the argument that if all 50 states get together and do a certain policy, it would be kind of weird if the federal government didn't also embrace that policy, especially if they all act simultaneously. Like, wow, if every single state gets together and decides that they want to do cap and trade for their dam systems, I would assume that the federal government would also be like, sure, let's do a cap and trade system for our federal dams, right? Like, why not? It seems to be what people want. I think this is an intuitive argument, and I also think that there's evidence for it. So you should always have it. It is very powerful, because if you can win follow-on, then that really means that, like, they don't really have a solvency deficit, because the effect of the counterplan is the AF. As long as you get out of any links to net benefit issues, saying that follow-on would happen after, their politics status happened, then I think you're doing real good. Next is specific solvency versus specific affirmatives. Again, this is kind of what I mean whenever I say innovate. You're probably going to want to build this section over the course of your year as teams break new affirmatives, try new things to beat states. You'll want to keep advancing and developing what you say, and have a really good, maybe you'll get to the point where you debate one team, and then the next time you debate them, you, have recuttings of all their internal link cards that all secretly advocate for the counterplan or whatever. All that stuff is really fun. Last is just blocks on blocks on blocks on blocks on blocks. Anything that they could throw at you, you want to have an answer to. You want to be ready. You want to get back at them for it, and really get them, and make sure that you are as prepared as possible for anything, because the state's counterplan is a tank. And if you can power it up as much as possible in the 1NC and follow through on that, it doesn't matter if your 2NC is mostly counterplan. It doesn't matter if your 1NC is super, heavy on the counterplan, and you spend, a minute or two reading it in the 1NC. Doesn't matter. It's coming for you no matter what, and it's going to take you out. Let's talk really quickly about net benefits before I go into how to answer the state's counterplan. The obvious one is, of course, politics. If you want to know more about that, check out Alyssa Corrigan's lecture on politics. It's intuitive. I don't really think I need to explain very much more than this. Federalism is the other obvious one. Again, check out the federalism lecture. It's fantastic, and we'll tell you all about federalism. You'll notice on this topic there's kind of two different kinds of federalism net benefits we have. We have the very standard vertical federalism argument that state power is good and that federal government action takes away and usurps state power over water policy. But we also have this like horizontal federalism net benefit to the interstate compacts counterplan, which I think is also kind of neat. I personally think that the perm do both, solves a good chunk of that horizontal federalism net benefit, but there are arguments to be made that it is its own net benefit and can stand perfectly on its own. The next genre is federal trade-off decides. Let's say that they have an argument about EPA getting overstretched by having to take on the affirmative. That's not something that the states have to do with because they don't use the EPA. Maybe Army Corps of Engineer trade-off decide, something like that as well. Any other kind of trade-off decide or any other kind of politics decide can work perfectly as a net benefit to states. The last one, or the next one is internal net benefits. I already mentioned this, horizontal federalism. I think internal net benefits are kind of weak. I think that they tend to get solved by the permutation. It's very hard for me to imagine why just doing the counterplan alone doesn't solve. Pardon me. But, look, politics is great, but it's also very fickle. And, you could be doing really good and you think you're going to go into the first tournament of the year with this great politics and states strat, and then all of a sudden, right before the first tournament of the year, something crazy happens. The disad passes, or I don't know. Politics is unpredictable, is what I'm saying. You never know what's going to happen, and so it does help to have a backup. While people like politics a little bit more than they like federalism or their trade-off disads, you should have one in the back pocket, so you can, have something to read with states. Because a counterplan is only as good as its net benefit. All right, we're making good time. We're already on to section 3, answering the counterplan. Whenever I've heard some folks learn SPOT, S-P-O-T. I always grew up learning plots, which is the same, just an extra L that stands for links to the benefit. So let's go through all of these one by one. I'll talk about what I think are good, what I think are bad arguments that we could be making, and we will go from there. So let's start with the P. P stands for permutations. You should always have one in the 2AC, and may as well always have one in the 1AR. Now, if a state's counterplan has some kind of weird internal net benefit about state action being good, either a regular perm do both, or maybe a creative permutation that does the affirmative, but also the part of the counterplan that solves the net benefit, I think that could work as well and can probably reconcile it. I at least think so. I also think that they can help versus politics. Maybe you can make some argument that if the states and federal government act simultaneously, that alleviates political pressure because, a senator is a lot less likely to vote against the affirmative or to struggle with the affirmative if they know that their state is also implementing that policy on a state level and that the people seem to want it. But that's imperfect. I wouldn't rely too much on that. I think the best utility is just as sort of like a general shielding argument. I wouldn't put all of your chips on that table. But I like always good to have a permutation there. You're probably never going to be winning perm to the counterplan unless their counterplan does the kind of shady thing where they include partial federal government action. Then maybe you could write some kind of like textually competitive permutation, but again, I don't really want to get too down that rabbit hole because I kind of think that's its own lecture about counterplan competition, and there's nothing that, I don't want to bore you all with counterplan competition right now. We can maybe do that in the Q&A if you're curious. L, links to the net benefit. I don't really think this is going to come up very often for, politics. It doesn't really seem like obvious. The argument that, the counterplan is done through the states, it doesn't include the federal government, ergo doesn't link to politics. I think that's fine. I think that whenever they start to add weird things like they fiat the federal government, or if they just get really absurd or something, maybe then we can talk about links to the net benefit. And again, it takes 2 seconds to say in the 2AC, may as well have it. But again, I don't think we're going to go all in on this. I don't really think this argument is going to get super far against the regular states counterplan. Offense is O. Give me a second. Sorry. State politics or trade-off disads are, I think, sort of the quintessential example of this that I've heard. Like let's say, I'll make one up on the spot. California. They are currently going through kind of an election to see if they want to get rid of their governor, Gavin Newsom. Perhaps the plan would cause him to lose that election if he's stuck to it, or maybe it'd cause him to win and you could say that he's bad. I don't know. Or you just have like a regular sort of like politics trade-off, like, oh, New York's focusing really hard on this initiative right now, but if they suddenly have to do this state policy, then they won't be able to do it, and that's bad. That's something. I'm going to be honest, I think that these are pretty mediocre. I think that they take a lot of time to invest because you have to, like, set up uniqueness and a link and an impact, and I don't really think that they have that much utility because then they can always just kick the counterplan. Like, you spend a lot of time in the 2AC setting up this awesome disad to their thing, and then they just kick it, and you're like, well, now what, It kind of puts you on the back foot. What I think is maybe a little bit better is a disad to their funding mechanism. Teams don't really actually think through their funding mechanisms for their state's counterplan very much, if they even have one. Obviously, if they don't have one, then, we can just go for a solvency deficit about that. But if they do have one, but it doesn't really seem like it makes that much sense, we can get a disad to it. Like, get a disad to, weed legalization, or get a disad to increasing taxes on the super wealthy, or whatever other kind of weird thing the negative will come up with. I think these are actually kind of decent. I think that these can be very helpful, because if you take out their funding mechanism, you can really take out kind of a lot of the counterplan in a lot of instances. And I think that they're a little bit easier to set up, and teams are less likely to have a defense of it. As I mentioned earlier, in my opinion, this is kind of meh. I don't really think it's fantastic. I also think that the negative can fiat out of a handful of these, so, 2&C counterplans are a thing. If you bring up something against them, they could always just 2&C counterplan to resolve whatever issue you've brought up. And there's obviously a different debate about whether or not 2&C counterplans are legitimate or justified, but either way, I think it's, again, just a time trade-off that might not really be worth your while. T. Theory. 50-state fiat is obviously the big one. As I've mentioned above, I think most judges at this point are not a very good sell on, the regular 50 states counterplan as a voting issue or a reason to reject the argument. I think that, like, on this topic especially, the question of whether or not the federal government or the states should enact water policy is very relevant. It's very much in the literature. If you're reading this counterplan, you probably have specific evidence about your state's counterplan, in which case you can say that your counterplan is relevant to topic literature, and they are the ones who are arbitrarily making the topic worse by choosing to exclude something that's important. I also think that, from kind of a fairness perspective, it's probably the only negative generic on this topic, and of course it is, in that sense, relevant to topic education. So I think that 50-state fiat is pretty justified. Again, as I mentioned above, uniformity can be a different question. Some folks get a little bit crankier about the idea that the negative gets to fiat all the 50 states act equally. But again, that's kind of what the interstate compacts are for, and so I think that you can kind of justify it. Also, just to me, any distinction made between, non-uniform and uniform 50-state fiat, it just feels a little bit arbitrary to me, but that's just kind of me. In my opinion, this isn't really a winner. Can be in the 2AC, but don't really think that this should make it too far, all else debated equally. Once again, if they fiat the federal government, though, this changes a little bit, and I think that you can definitely make a pretty strong theory argument about multi-actor fiat being bad. Maybe you can also combine it with your permutation to sort of theoretically justify whatever permutation you have. That, I think, is a different scenario, and one in which theory can actually become a very powerful tool. Again, you'll notice that whenever you include the federal government, it really changes how you answer the counterplan. Last one. I know that I've been kind of mediocre on all these. I haven't really mentioned, I haven't been speaking too happily about all these answers to the counterplan. You'd almost think that I'm a bit of a 2N biased. But let's talk about solvency deficits, because I think this is the big one, and this is where the debate will be won or lost most of the time. How are they going to say the federal government is key? I'll start with kind of the mediocre ones. First, uniformity or centralization. I've talked about this plenty. I think interstate compacts are a really good way to answer any deficits about uniformity, um, and that's kind of that. I think that they totally are able to steamroll most arguments about how uniform implementation is key. Inaction, the argument that states aren't doing anything, so the federal government has to step in. This is silly. The counterplan fiats that the states no longer enact. Fiats that the states no longer are not doing anything. So, like, it's the definition of fiat solves, right? Federal expertise or implementation. This could maybe be something. I think it's pretty aft dependent. But there is a lot of evidence, and this is kind of brought up in prior lectures, that the states actually have a lot of the expertise whenever it comes to implementing water policy. They're the one. It's their bodies of water. It's the one that's close. It's the one that's in their backyard. I don't really think the federal government knows too much about how each individual state's water policies implemented. So it actually seems like this is an argument for the counterplan a lot of the time, that counterplans actually has a better amount of expertise and implementation details than the affirmative does. But maybe you have a specific affirmative that actually does have something that only the federal government has expertise in which case I think that this argument becomes a little bit better and is maybe no longer mediocre. The question is just then, what's the impact of that expertise? Do you just kind of say generally expertise means they don't solve, or do you have like a specific advantage or internal link that says expertise is necessary? I think that is kind of the threshold for me. Next one is modeling. Modeling is kind of popular as like a deficit to the counterplan. I don't really think it makes sense, right? Like, you think that the federal government is much more of a big deal than the state is, but there's actually a lot of evidence that says that, particularly in the past 4 years with the Trump administration, states have kind of been like stepping up whenever it comes to environmental modeling, and that other nations actually work with states a lot whenever it comes to implementing environmental policy. There's a lot of examples of California working with other nations to figure out this stuff. The other argument is one that there isn't really evidence for, but I think is just kind of intuitive, is I don't know, imagine if you woke up one day and you saw that over in America every single one of the states and territories decided to do something all at the same time. Like, you would probably think that they're pretty serious about it, right? You wouldn't just think that, like, oh, well, that doesn't matter because Congress didn't pass it. Like, no, it's probably a big deal. So I think that modeling isn't that good an argument. Delay is also a bad argument. Maybe it could be good. I have a theory that there's a specific counterplan that could actually be delayed, but I don't think it's great for two reasons. Number one, there's a lot of delay that just happens with government in general. I don't really see why, even if you have a card that says that the states move slowly, why the federal government doesn't also move slowly. Additionally, I think there's very rarely an impact to delay. Let's say that even if you're reading the affirmative, like the invasive species affirmative, which is all about, like, we gotta stop these carp from getting into the Great Lakes as soon as possible. Even then, what's the difference between 8 months wait and 10 months wait? Or even like 1 year and 3 years? Like, how do you quantify that those months as a deficit? It seems kind of difficult, right? So I don't know. I'm not really feeling delay, and I don't think very many judges are either. Last is funding sometimes. Again, if their counterplan text has a funding mechanism, you obviously got to answer that. If they do have one and you just say funding, then you're not going to get very far. But if you have specific answers to their mechanism, that's good. I think it can get you pretty far. I also think that, again, some offense to their mechanism can be good. And I think that maybe you can have some internal links about, like, maybe private actor investment, and that they only care about what the federal government does. They don't care about the states. I think that's kind of mediocre for the modeling, for the argument I made above on modeling, that all states acting together sends a pretty big signal. But again, it can be good, can be bad, which is why I put it last and said sometimes. Last one is, quote, but our card says the federal government should act. You will not believe how many debates I have been in or seen where the affirmative is like, they went for states, but they conceded that our 1AC solvency card says the federal government is key. And I'm like, okay, let's check out this card. And it literally just says that, like, the federal government should do the plan. Saying that the federal government should do something is not the same thing as the states cannot do something. Does that make, like, hopefully that makes sense. Saying the federal government should act does not mean the states cannot act. And so I don't think that that is an argument for why the states cannot solve. What about some better arguments? Indites to compacts. If you have cards that say that for your AF, a compact would require Congress, I think that's great. I think that that is really good, and you could pretty easily win that maybe links to net benefit, or at least links to net benefit a decent amount if we're talking about politics. I think other arguments that compacts just don't work or aren't implemented evenly or are actively bad, I think those are good arguments. You'll notice that the reason why I say they're good is because they're more specific to the counterplan. You're really getting at the meat of the counterplan more. You're kind of outmaneuvering them. So I think that if these cards, I haven't read through a lot of them. I don't know if there are a lot of cards that are really good on this question, but I think that if you have them, use them. These could be pretty good. Next one is actor key warrants. Let's say you have an advantage that's all about Congress. Let's say you have an advantage that's all about the EPA. I think that those can be pretty good. Now, obviously, the states can still advantage counterplan to solve them. So, like, again, if your impact to Congress is like, I don't know, disease preparedness, you can have the states do their own disease preparedness measures. But it's still good because it's something that the affirmative can point to and be like, this entire advantage is about this thing, and the state solves none of it. That's I think something cool that you could point to. And it's pretty persuasive for judges. Last one is jurisdiction. This is obviously very dependent upon your affirmative, and I can't really think of a lot of great examples for it, but they definitely exist. Like, the affirmative does something that's exclusively within the realm of the federal government. Like, either the states have literally no jurisdiction over it, the federal government blocks states from having jurisdiction over it, the federal government, it's on federal property that states don't regulate. You can't really do much about that. The states just don't have the power to do that. If you have to do something about that, you would probably need to bite the bullet and fiat the federal government to some extent, which again gets into all the problems that I've outlined prior. You could get a little crazy and have, like, I don't know, let's say that their answer to the state's counterplan is that, like, the federal government will strike down or kill the counterplan. You could get a little bit weird and, like, fiat the states ignore the federal government and, like, nullify their action, but that gets a little crazy and a little bit wild. And probably maybe links to net benefit. It shouldn't be your A strat, basically, is what I'm saying. I think jurisdiction deficits are the best ones. And I think that if you write an AF that the states literally cannot do, then that's your best way to beat the states. Prevent them from reading it in the first place. Jurisdiction and strike down are similar in my argument, like the argument that the federal government will strike down the counterplan. Again, if you have that, then yeah, read it. Okay, sorry about that. All this is to say that if you're an affirmative team, you need to be writing your affirmatives keeping a good solvency deficit in mind. That doesn't mean, like, oh, we have our worst advantage is about modeling, or like we have one thing that says now is key, so that's our delay deficit. Like, it doesn't cut it. A good affirmative has, like, a really good federal key internal link or a really good federal key advantage. If you're negative and the affirmative claims that they have that, read their evidence, because there's a decent chance that they're just going to be lying to you. Because affirmative teams love to lie. It's kind of what happens. All right. Final kind of section I'm going to talk about, we are making really good time, aren't we? Is this section that I call things that are not the state's counterplan but are kind of like it, so I am talking about them anyway, I guess. Or this acronym for short. I have 3 examples. The first is the Lopez Counterplan, or sometimes it gets called the Devolution Counterplan. What is it? I'll say that this is actually kind of similar to what I mentioned above, the idea of, like, fiating the federal government ignores whatever the counterplan is doing. This is sort of similar to that. The reason why it's called Lopez is because it's named after, a Supreme Court decision, the U.S. v. Lopez case. It's kind of important in, like, law school circles, government circles. The case was about a student who had a gun in a school, and they tried to, he was sued for it, but then he claimed that it was like the law against it was like an extension of Congress's power, and the Supreme Court basically ended up deciding that, Congress had overstepped and that it was actually within the bounds of state authority. Don't quote me on that, though. I'm not a law guy. I'm not in law school, and I, very briefly looked at this. Um, what does the counterplan do, though? The counterplan would rule that the plan is actually the authority of the states, and then probably fiats the states do the plan. So let's say their AF is all about restructuring the EPA, and you have literally nothing you can talk about that the states can do. You could just be like, the Supreme Court should rule that the EPA is actually the state's job to take care of, and then the states should do the F. This is obviously super cheesy and kind of definitely cheaty. Like, the affirmative actually has an AF that says federal government key, and your response is to just have the Supreme Court fiat that it's no longer the federal government. It's pretty silly. So how do you answer it? First argument is theory. You are doing multi-actor fiat by doing this because you're fiating this government does something, the Supreme Court does something, and then also fiating the states do something. Also, just like Lopez counterplans are bad in the abstract is a pretty good argument that I think people find pretty compelling. It's obviously not within the literature. No one has ever written a card that advocates whatever version of the Lopez counterplan they're reading. There's a 0% chance they have a topic-specific card advocating Lopez. And I think that can get you pretty far by proving that the counterplan is not a germane opportunity cost to the affirmative. Other thing is creative permutations. Because the AF includes the federal government, you could again write a perm that's, I think, textually competitive by saying, like, the United States Supreme Court should, and then pick up the part at the end that includes the rest of the affirmative. By the way, I should clarify, anytime I've said, creative permutations, or anytime I will say it, please write out your permutations in the 2AC. You can make your partner write them if your partner is good at, counterplan competition and textual competition and stuff. This is completely unrelated to the content of the lecture. I'm just begging everyone to do this. If you're going to be making weird perms, please write the text of the permutation out. You don't have to read it. You can just make the perm and then be like, text is in the doc. It just makes every judge's life way easier. So please, please, please do it. Sorry, that's a bit of a side tangent. I apologize. Last is just that no one wants to vote on Lopez. It's so stale. It's been around forever. It never changes for the topic in any meaningful way. I mean, prove me wrong, I guess, but there just obviously aren't very many good actual disads or solvency arguments here, so you really have to lean in pretty hard on theory in the perm if you're going to beat this counterplan. But know that you have judge bias on your side, because no one really likes the Lopez counterplan. The next one is the NGA counterplan, or the state pressure counterplan. I have no idea if this is going to be a thing this year. I'm just talking about it because it was massive last year for some godforsaken reason. For those of you who maybe didn't debate last year or would like a refresher on this counterplan, the NGA is the National Governors Association. It's basically just the governors of all 50 states, and it's the group that they have where they, I don't know, hang out together and play ping pong or something. It used to be run by Andrew Cuomo, but now it's actually run by the governor of Arkansas, whose name escapes me right now, but this is pretty recent. This is in like the past week or so, I'm pretty sure. Anyway, the idea behind the counterplan slightly varies. Maybe it doesn't fiat the NGA, maybe it just fiats the state governments, but generally the idea is that it has the NGA or state governments pressure the USFG to do the affirmative. So like, hey, federal government, if you don't do this cap and trade dam policy, we will refuse to cooperate with you on any federal initiatives. And we'll, never work with you again, and we'll be your worst nightmare, and you're gonna hate us. The net benefit to this is usually about uncooperative federalism. During the Trump administration, it was very common to read this like warming impact, which says basically the idea, not to talk too much about federalism again, but the idea that states refusing or challenging or going further than the federal government on things is a good model to set for whenever we have a Republican administration that doesn't want to do anything about climate change, but states that do want to do things about climate change. That doesn't really make any sense anymore because Joe Biden is in office, and a lot of these states generally are ideologically aligned with Joe Biden. So I don't really know what the new trending net benefit is, but it's probably pretty silly. Again, I'm very thumbs down on this. I do not like this counterplan. I think it's very silly. There's a lot of folks who are a big fan of it, but it's not. I don't like it. Anyway, how do we answer it? First, the NGA is a totally useless organization. I don't actually know what they get up to. I don't actually know if they just play ping pong all day. But no one credibly thinks that the National Governors Association has any kind of political or policy-making clout, especially whenever it pertains to what the federal government does. At best, they'll, like, sign a document saying that they think the government should do this, but, like, I don't know. That and a quarter gets me a phone call at a toll booth. So, that is to say, I don't really think it matters very much. Second, the counterplan is obviously very foolish. It would not be taken seriously or taken credibly. I don't really think anyone expects the Republican governor of Arkansas to go up to Joe Biden and say, you need to do this environmentally friendly policy or else, like, that would never happen. That's very silly. Why do people suddenly care so much about water policy? And given that the counterplan solvency is predicated off of the government believing it and taking the bait, why would the government believe it? Last, permutations. There are very many permutations that I think solve this, because you could do the affirmative through the process of the counterplan in a lot of ways. Again, you just have to write it out creatively. But again, put the permutation text in, please. Make it easy for the judges. I really hope this doesn't come back. I do not like this kind of... All three of these counterplans I'm talking about, I do not like these ones. I should have put frowny faces in all of them. These are not good counterplans. Regular states is awesome. It's perfect. It makes for great debates. These make for terrible debates. Please don't rely on these. Just read states. It's so good on this topic. Just read states, please. Last one is ConCon or amendments. I'm being such a bummer. I'm so sorry. What is a ConCon? A ConCon stands for a constitutional convention. This is just the process by which... So there are two ways that an amendment can be ratified to the Constitution. One of them has Congress initiate the process, and then the states have to support it, and then it becomes an amendment. The second one is a constitutional convention. I'm 80% sure this has never happened before, but it is a mechanism by which basically all the states get together, and on their own, the states can get together, have a convention, approve a new amendment, and then pass it. It, again, has never been done before, so that's maybe a theory argument against it, but basically what it does is it just has the counterplan, which just has the ConCon get together, they amend the Constitution that says that the AF is needed. The net benefit is, of course, usually politics, both because it doesn't involve the federal government, but also because the process of a constitutional convention can maybe take a while, and so it probably would pass after the politics decide has already passed. How do you answer it? Theory. This counterplan is kind of picked up in popularity because it's very, very, very low effort on the negatives part. Like, you literally just read these, really tiny basic cards that are AP Gov 101, here's what a ConCon is, and there's not a lot that the affirmative can say solvency-wise that answers it. So I do think that you can and probably should make a pretty robust theory argument as to why ConCon counterplans are bad. Obviously, the negatives' main argument is that the method of a ConCon is actually in the, Constitution, which I think is kind of a tough argument to go up against, but I don't think it's impossible to go for theory against this, and I think that if you're good at it, if your chops are up to snuff, you can win. You can definitely win on theory. Next one is, again, my favorite, tricky permutations. Amendments are not self-enforcing, so presumably the counterplan would have to fiat that there's some kind of enforcement of the counterplan, which in this case would just be the plan, which means that you could counterplan to do the plan through the process of the counterplan. There's also, a kind of intrinsic perm you can do that assumes that because there's multiple steps to the ConCon counterplan, because there's a delay component, you could intrinsically craft a delayed plan out of it. Again, this is a little confusing, and I don't want to get too into the weeds on this, but just know that there are permutations that can get you out of this thing, and if you're really curious about some of them, I can talk about them in the Q&A session, if you'd like. Next one is a runaway convention decide. This is one where I do think that this is a piece of offense that should be in every 2AC. Runaway conventions are the idea that whenever we get together for a constitutional convention, there's no theoretical limit to what we would propose. And so while the counterplan only intends to get together a constitutional convention to advocate the affirmative, it's entirely possible that a ton of other Republican states could tack on their ideas to the ConCon as well. So there's been a lot of kind of discourse percolating within Republican states that a balanced budget amendment would be part of a constitutional convention that it would literally stop the government from deficit spending. These are kind of advocated by conservatives who don't like it that the government is kind of, spends too much on deficit and has kind of a big debt. And so they would literally amend the Constitution to make that impossible. I don't really need to be the one to tell you, although I will, that that would be pretty chaotic. So I really, really think that there's a good argument to be made there. And there are cards which say that any ConCon that would ever be formed would result in a runaway convention, which could be pretty catastrophic and cause a lot of bad things. The last thing I'll say is that you probably shouldn't read any evidence that's that old on it. There were a lot of cards written about why ConCons are bad from like the 90s. Those cards have already been cut, and answers to those cards have already been cut, and the answers are pretty good. So I don't really think it's a good idea to read super old evidence. Again, you'll notice that the one main theme throughout all these counterplans, all these like variations on the state's counterplans, is number one, it's hard to win a solvency deficit. Number two, the best AF strategy is usually some kind of theory or perm push. And number three, I don't like these very much. Part of the reason I don't like them is because I think that they're, again, very low effort at the part of the negative. You don't really have to do much AF-specific research the way you kind of do for the state's counterplan. But unfortunately, high schoolers just aren't that good at permutations and theory, which is understandable because, like, it's very difficult to do, and it's hard for the 1AR to answer a 2NC block that's like a minute of why the counterplan is good and why their perm is bad. But you gotta sometimes. You gotta do what you gotta do. You gotta beat those bad counterplans, and so that is, I think, the way that we should do it. I, again, would very much distinguish all these counterplans from the regular states counterplan. I'm really here advocating for you to be reading the regular states counterplan. I'm not advocating for these. But there you go. That is what these three variations are, and how I think we answer them. Again, no one wants to vote on this. At least I hope so. There are probably some judges who do. Maybe I'm projecting here, but I don't think anyone wants to vote on this. All right. That is all I have. Again, to kind of summate everything, I think... Oh, pardon me. To sort of summate everything, I really do think that even if you think, oh, it's generic, everyone sees it's coming, everyone's got their own block, there's really something kind of badass about having your opponents know that you're going to go for the state's counterplan. I mean, prepping out a really big block and you just kind of roll through them with it. I really do think that it's such a tank, and I'm such a fan of this counterplan. I think it's so powerful, even against a lot of affirmatives. I really think that, the only scenario in which the state's counterplan doesn't become that powerful on this topic is one in which teams are so scared of it that they really write affirmatives that are exclusively within federal jurisdiction. Like, they only write affs that are about, like, I don't know, the EPA or something, or about the Army Corps. It remains to be seen whether or not that happens. Maybe I'm overrating this counterplan a little bit. Maybe it doesn't end up having that much of a win rate. From my vantage point, from my kind of negative hat that I always like to have on, I think this is so good. I think it's really powerful. And, even in the case in which it doesn't become that powerful and in which most affirmatives are really federal only, that only proves how strong the state's counterplan is, because the topic wouldn't look like this if it wasn't for the state's counterplan. That's how strong it is. So, okay. Sorry, don't mean to ramble there, although I 1,000,000% did at the end, didn't I? Thank you all very much for listening. I really appreciate it if you made it to the end of all my rambling. I hope to see you all at Q&A. Bring me some questions. I'll do my best to get you some answers. And happy debating. Take it easy.